Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at the Atlantic magazine.
And hi, I'm John Tabin. I'm a contributor to the American Spectator.
And we're going to focus on election stuff today, election 2012, Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama. And why don't we start talking about this trip abroad that Mitt Romney took?
It's kind of a weird thing that he sort of stepped in this controversy over the Olympics. I feel like it was one of these Kinsley gaffes where you accidentally say what's true or what you and it becomes a big blowout. And also, I just don't think he was ready for how tough the British press can be.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Yeah, it's interesting how he goes over to London and he basically makes a relatively innocuous comment. He says, I heard, I guess there were some security contractors who were supposed to provide security for the Olympics, and they ended up not being able to hire enough employees, and so British military guys had to step in and supply some of the extra manpower. And Romney basically said that he'd heard of that story, and it was concerning, and he hoped that they would be ready, or something innocuous like that. And it just got really blown up in the British press. And
it wasn't like it was.
I guess he should have.
It wasn't
better.
like it was a left-wing attack. Like it was like British Tories were like pissed at him. And I think that's probably a thing about conservatives everywhere, that it's sort of an instinct that even if you're right, if you don't get to criticize from the outside. But you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely true that had some foreign leader, not even a foreign leader, had some foreign politician come to the United States on the eve of an Olympics and said, "Well, maybe you guys aren't ready. Maybe your security's not ready." It probably would have drawn the same kind of response in the New York Post and as it did in the British tabloids. I think it kind of came at a bad time for Romney because he wanted this trip abroad to be all about how he was more cognizant of the special relationship the United States has.
Obama's had some pretty kind of embarrassing gaffes related to the relationship with Britain. The White House did some hilariously incompetent spin on this week because Charles Krauthammer mentioned in his column that they'd returned this bust of Winston Churchill that had been in the Oval Office to the ambassador's residence. It had been in the Oval Office during Bush's term on loan. They offered to let Obama keep it. Instead he wanted a bust of Abraham Lincoln in the Oval Office, so he returned it. And this White House spokesman put out this statement after Krauthammer mentioned this in his column, was like, "That's a myth. We still have the Winston Churchill bust in another room of the White House." And as it turned out, there were two Winston Churchill busts in the White House. The one in the other room was not the one that was in the Oval Office during the Bush administration, given back to the ambassador's residence. So it just shows that drawing a contrast, saying you're more respectful to the special relationship than Barack Obama, who also, he gave, if I remember correctly, he gave the Queen an iPod of his own, an iPod full of his own speeches, and he gave the Prime Minister DVDs that were the wrong region, so you couldn't play them in Britain. And
I think that giving the
all he had to do was not.
I think I'm inclined to look past.
He did better than Obama.
Right. I mean, I'm inclined to look past all of these sort of mistakes, or even. I mean, I don't actually think that the Churchill bust is a mistake that Obama made, but to me, giving the Queen an iPod with your speeches on it is a legitimate It's a gaffe. It shows poor judgment as far as diplomatic relations go. And I think, again, I don't think this is anything anyone should hold against Romney. I think it showed poor judgment to go and criticize, a country right on the eve of its Olympics. It was something that couldn't possibly get him anything and could lose him things. But I almost think that the lesson here is that every president coming in their first term is going to have a learning curve as far as being hypersensitive and aware to speaking in front of foreign audiences, and that it's just it just comes with the territory, and everything is magnified. So is it rational for anyone to be offended by any of this stuff? I don't think it is, but it all gets blown up in the press. And I guess I'm just inclined on both sides to look past a lot of even what are technically gaffes or show a poor instant of good judgment, just because who's possibly going to step into that position and not ever make a small error, if you even want to call these errors.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that it's not a huge deal, but it would be more comforting if the candidate for president had someone around him to say, hey, the British press is super sensitive about special relationship stuff and try to be, you need to be walking on eggshells. Because Romney is a very, very cautious speaker in public, and it just seems like he let his guard down because, he just, and it is the kind of thing that the American press didn't notice at all, but it blew up in the British press. And,
right. Well, and perhaps it was also that he, having presided over the process of the Olympics in Utah, perhaps it was just a topic where his experience caused him to let down his guard and start talking off the cuff a little bit more than he might have, because it's something that he's
like we said at the beginning, he was right. It's just the sort of in-group, out-group etiquette violation. It kind of reminded me of who's that congressman who who recently got in I think he's in Illinois, Joe Walsh. Joe Walsh has had a couple of gaffes where I've noticed the common thread was he said things that you can't say as an out-group member. And the most recent one was his opponent is an injured veteran, and he basically says real heroes don't talk about their injuries in service as much as she does. Which, if you're not a veteran, you really have no place saying. And the other thing he said that kind of caused controversy, and this was a while back, was it was a column in the Daily Caller that he was writing about Israel, and he said and where are Jewish liberals? Which is the kind of thing that I, as a Jewish conservative, say sometimes, but it still made me go ugh, because he's not Jewish, and there's sort of an etiquette around things you can say as an in-group and out-group that sometimes people don't grasp. And I think it's the same thing whenever you hear people say, why can't white people say the N-word? There's a certain blindness to that I...
Right, yeah. Well, and so I guess one question that I think is pretty tricky is, for members of the press, how should these, whether you want to call them gaffes or whether you want to call them tempest in a teapot, or whatever you think of them, how should the press cover them? And I think it's a really tricky question, because on one hand, a presidential candidate or a president, if they are needlessly pissing off foreign populations, even if what they say is right, that's arguably a bad thing. Certainly, it's a thing that reflects on how their ability to do their job, right? On the other hand, I get uncomfortable when the press is attacking people for saying things that are true, but that are controversial, right? That are true, but that they should have known better than to say. Because I think that you can get into these situations where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The press is covering a gaffe because it's the sort of thing that will upset people, and people are upset because the press is covering it. And if it was covered differently, everyone would forget about it 5 minutes later.
Right. I think that critique applies more. It applies in a lot of cases. In this case, because the British press led with it, I think the American press has to talk about how things are being perceived abroad. Right. But in most cases, it gets kind of weirdly meta. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's transition into talking about Romney's foreign policy generally and the substance of what he wants to do, because that's what this trip was, of course, intended to do. He was going to visit Britain and Poland, and is he going to Israel on this trip as well?
He actually just landed in. We're talking on Saturday afternoon. He just landed in Israel a few hours ago, and he's going to Poland next.
Okay, and so he's picked these countries where he wants to highlight countries where he thinks that. He thinks we should have different relationships, I guess, than the ones that President Obama has sort of brought about during his term, and he wants to signal, I'm going to be a better friend to Israel, I'm going to,
and I think,
I guess, have a better relationship with Britain.
I think
so what is his
he'll have a lot easier time with
policy
that in Israel because the Israelis are very unhappy with Obama and will be primed to be, I mean, if you've ever talked to, there's a Israeli liberal elite, but, 80% of Israelis are dissatisfied with Obama, mostly over a couple of big missteps early in the term. But Netanyahu and Obama just kind of clearly despise each other. So, and interestingly enough, Netanyahu and Romney have known each other since the 70s because they worked for the same company at one point. So I expect the Israel leg of the trip to go better.
So do you think that there is actually, do you think if Mitt Romney becomes president, he's actually going to pursue a qualitatively different foreign policy toward Israel? Like what's going to be the difference?
I can't see Romney. I can't see Romney openly objecting to construction in a suburb of Jerusalem that everyone knows is going to be part of a Jewish state under any conceivable peace settlement, which is what Obama did with Ramat Shlomo early in the term. It was the Israelis screwed up on that too because there was a announcement made the day Joe Biden was in the country, and it was understandably kind of off-putting to the administration, but it wasn't something that Netanyahu had control over, and it became it caused some really unnecessary friction. And it's been pretty clear that Obama had he had a meeting with some Jewish leaders long ago, and I think it was very significant. Someone was making the argument that the United States needs to have basically no daylight with Israel for various security reasons, and the story goes that Obama leaned back and said, I disagree, we've had 50 years of no daylight and 50 years of peace, which is a very common, the environment that Obama comes from, that's a pretty common way of thinking about it, and I think he may have realized, being in the Oval Office, why that invites more problems than it solves when you try to open up fights with Israel and don't really have a strategy for following through with them. But I don't see Romney getting into those same problems. But on the other hand, when I feel like Romney is on every other issue, he tends to hedge on things in very cautious ways that it's kind of hard to see where he's coming from, and the classic example is in the last round in 2008 in the primary, he had Mitchell Rice and Dan Senior were his top advisors, and Dan Senior is a guy who served in the Bush administration, was a big supporter of the Iraq War and a big supporter of the surge, and Mitchell Rice was a surge skeptic. So those were his top advisors. Mitchell Rice is more of a sort of quote-unquote realist, and when Romney was asked about his opinion on the surge in the debate, McCain gave a straight answer because he had strong convictions about. He's been basically advocating it since a few months into the
Very
war.
surge.
But Romney sort of equivocated about it, which is understandable because his two top advisors disagreed about it. And I think there are a lot of things like that where he doesn't have the convictions that, it's kind of a mystery. It sort of depends on who ends up having his ear, what he'd actually do as president.
But yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of disagreement about, Jeff Goldberg at The Atlantic just had a column recently about how he thinks that Romney would be less likely to go to war with Iran, if I'm remembering correctly. And I've read other people that basically think exactly the opposite. Daniel Larison is someone that has repeatedly written posts about how he thinks it's silly, all these people who are saying that Romney might actually be more dovish than Obama would, and that Romney has clearly surrounded himself with some of the most hawkish people from the Bush administration and hasn't repudiated the Bush administration's foreign policy. So I don't know. What do you think? You and I have very different ideas of what our foreign policy.
Yeah, I guess we should for
certainly more
viewers
than I am,
who have no idea who
think,
I am. I should probably give some background. I actually am someone who thinks that the freedom agenda that George Bush laid out in his second inaugural address has a lot of value, and whatever strategic and tactical mistakes were based in the Bush administration, I think there's been a lot of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in the sort of Republican move away from trying to make neocon a dirty word, and interestingly enough, Josh Rogan the other day at Foreign Policy had an interview with one of Romney's foreign policy advisors. The heading was "Romney Campaign Obama Failing on Democracy and Human Rights," and says that Romney is about to open up a new front against Obama on foreign policy. He'll ramp up his criticism of the administration's record on democracy promotion and human rights and begin talking about the freedom agenda, which I'd love to see, but I'll believe it when I see it. This is an interview with one advisor, and Josh is a very, very good reporter. I'm sure he picked out something significant from this interview, but his advisor saying this doesn't necessarily convince me that he's on the same page as I am, especially since the page I'm on has become very unpopular. And
right.
And I think Romney is driven by sort of a salesman instinct sometimes, and so as someone who supports, as you put it, the freedom agenda, sort of what Bush laid down in his second. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
is that better? Okay, so as someone who supports the freedom agenda, or what Bush laid out in his second inaugural, how did you feel about the intervention in Libya?
Well, I sort of went through some stages on it. I was advocating a no-fly zone pretty early on, and that was about 3 weeks later, the UN resolution actually passed, and I wrote something that was kind of equivocal because I still thought that there's about to be a massacre in Benghazi. It's worth preventing that, but I wasn't sure. I was afraid it was too late, and I think I was wrong about that because, in fact, the rebels did end up defeating Gaddafi, and I don't mean to minimize the spillover of weapons into Mali and the human rights abuses by the rebels and all the rest of it, but I think on balance, the principle that our interests and our values are intimately connected, and allowing a dictator across the pond from Europe to commit a mass murder is not something not something the West is willing to do. I do think that was a good thing to affirm at the point of cruise missiles. So,
right. So do you nevertheless? I mean, you're saying that you weren't exactly sure where Romney is going to come down, and I think that puts you in the same camp as me and a lot of people. Are you confident that by your lights he's going to be better than Obama on foreign policy?
I'm confident that I'd say yes. Yes, I would say that, and the reason is I think Obama has made some mistakes that are very specific to a kind of sort of liberal multilateralist viewpoint. He's the advisor who said on Background that they were leading from behind on Libya. I'm sure they wish they'd never said that, but I do think it was revealing that Obama sees the United States at best as first among equals, not as a dominant hegemon. And while I don't know like I said, I don't know what Romney feels in his heart of hearts, I think he'd be less likely to make the kinds of decisions that flow from that sort of instinct. Now,
but it seems like, I mean, so maybe I'm missing something, but it seems like on Libya, you're saying, on one hand, that ultimately you think that basically the right thing happened, that it was correct to intervene, and that the rebels ultimately came out on top, and of course there weren't any American casualties. But on the other hand, that you object to the way that Obama, or at least some of his advisors, speaking to the press, how they framed it.
My concern at the time was that, and like I said, because as it turned out, my concern, as it turned out, it seemed to work out okay. But my concern at the time was that by making the decision contingent on what they could make happen at the UN, they were elevating sort of a transnational sort of ideology about the importance of transnational institutions above interests and values. I think at the time that they went to the UN, I think they could have easily done it with a NATO coalition, and I think that's
wait. They did in fact do it with
right, but they didn't. But not until they had the UN resolution, and I think the Russians sort of thought they were voting for something different than what they did. It was a war that was very dishonestly sold in a lot of ways, and I do have some, because it wasn't. I mean, the UN resolution said establish a no-fly zone, which means bomb the air defenses and prevent planes from flying. But that wasn't actually what they did. They provided close air support for one side in the Civil War, and that's more than what a no-fly zone means. Like, some people said, okay, it's a no-fly zone plus, which, okay, I'm for that, but it really wasn't. It wasn't the UN policy, and nor should.
Right.
Go ahead.
I guess I understand why someone with your views would be uncomfortable with going to the UN and would prefer not setting the precedent or strengthening the norm of having the UN be a step between military action and the United States wanting to take military action and in fact taking military action. But I guess that seems like a different argument with the Obama administration. In other words, if you believe in the freedom agenda, right, then that doesn't imply anything about what the best way to carry the freedom agenda out is. I mean, it seems like there are liberal interventionists.
Sure.
Who would say,
well, the way
we too want freedom, but the most effective way to carry it out in the long term is by, marrying it to the legitimacy that only international institutions provide, and that we can accomplish more working through them than we can going.
Right, and that's the classic Wilsonian view about spreading democracy and the importance of multilateralism. And I think the second part of that is a weakness in that. And I think what we now call neoconservatives, although the intellectual history of neoconservatism makes that a little bit dicey, but I won't go off on that rant. But the insight of that was that there are elements of the Jacksonian and Wilsonian strains of American foreign policy that are both valuable, and right now I feel like the mainstream of Democrats are too Wilsonian and the mainstream Republicans are too Jacksonian. There's sort of this there's a large strain in the Republican Party that's kill them if they bother us, but otherwise to hell with them. And I think there's something short-sighted about that.
I think that where I am, it's someplace different from both most Republicans and most Democrats. I guess my biggest concern, I wasn't in favor of the campaign in Libya, but the thing that bothered me about it more even than the actual on-the-ground material support we provided was the way that we went about it domestically.
Yeah.
Which is to say, I think that what we did in Libya should require congressional
permission. It is problematic when the president is making the case to the UN before he's even made it to the American table. And it's also problematic when the legal justification for the war was a complete hash. There are a couple ways you can approach some executive power or something like Libya. You can take the sort of John Yoo view that this is inherent to Article 2 powers, that this isn't that the Congress's power is to declare war, but that's not the same thing as making war. That's a power that's a diplomatic power that had to do with how the diplomacy of warfare worked at the time of the founding, and the other view you can take is that the declare clause translates to today as the sort of hard libertarian. The president is doing something illegal unless he gets authorization from Congress, and the War Powers Act was sort of an attempt to reconcile that by saying, okay, the president can start a military action unilaterally, but within a set period of time, he has to get approval from Congress. And what the administration did, they didn't say the War Powers Act was unconstitutional. They just tried to interpret their way around it. Like, they said, okay, this doesn't apply because it's not really a war. What they tried to say was this is not really a war, which is silly.
Yeah. I think they took a completely untenable position. I think what conservatives really believe, I shouldn't say all conservatives, I think what a lot of conservatives really believe about this issue, that they aren't quite willing to say because it puts them in an uncomfortable position. And I think actually the thought process is this, that I think that they acknowledge generally that the Constitution gives the power to declare war to Congress. I think that a lot of conservatives think that that process is antiquated because the founders came up in a world where you had to sail an army across the ocean if Europe wanted to attack us, right? They didn't come up in a world where things happened as quickly. And I think that there is a pretty broad consensus among conservatives that the commander-in-chief has to be able to respond quickly and sometimes to preemptively take action quickly in order to protect the interests of the United States. And it seems to me that they're almost making a version of the living, breathing Constitution argument, where they're saying, yeah, but this document has to evolve with the times and take into consideration.
I actually think it's actually, in a way, it's the opposite of the living Constitution argument. The Constitution means exactly what it said then, and it just happens to be mooted by the way the world's changed. And I'd phrase it slightly different than you did. I'll give you an example. Max Boot's book, The Savage Wars of Peace, it's a pretty detailed history of American military action, and a lot of the theme of it is that there's sort of a myth that up until Theodore Roosevelt or whatever, the United States basically didn't intervene in the world, and that's not really true. And he goes through a lot of undeclared wars, like the Barbary Wars and things like that, but one of the things he mentions is this kind of weird little incident, something like the Marquess Islands, but I'm probably saying it wrong, but the point is there was a war between islanders that an American naval unit happened to get involved in. And it was different in scale, but it wasn't that different in nature than what happened in Libya, except that the naval captains couldn't communicate with Washington, so they were acting unilaterally. And actually, Charles Krauthammer had a column a while, I think it was during Libya, where he said, we need to, he said, taken literally, the power to declare war is the power to control buggy whip, because countries don't declare war anymore. That was a diplomatic convention of the 18th and early 19th century that has fallen by the wayside. And his suggestion was, like, the War Powers Act was an attempt to deal with that, but it failed. And he suggested sort of codifying the tradition of having things like the authorization for use of military force in Iraq, these sort of declarations declarations in spirit, if not explicit. That should be codified somehow, but it's not. And
I think that the Iraq War, the vote that took place before the Iraq War satisfied me as far as separation of powers concerns. I would say that I think that separation of powers was the intent of the founders and is what we ought to be worried about now, that they did not want to give unrestrained power to wage war to the executive branch because they had the experience of a king and saw that the executive would have an interest in waging war when the country didn't have an interest in it. And I'm frustrated by, I haven't read Max Boot's book, but by your description of it, I'm frustrated by these instances of looking back into American history and plucking out precedents for what I would regard as extra-constitutional wars, because it's really the only time you'll see conservatives pick out something that happened decades and decades ago and said, well, they did this thing then, so it must have been constitutional, right? In every other instance, you see conservatives saying, oh, FDR did all of these things. That didn't set the precedent and say they're okay. He was actually violating the Constitution back then when he did that. And I guess that's how I feel about. I certainly agree that the United States has not always gone through Congress and declared war every time it's used force in its history. And I would not want to point to a president today, whether it's Bush or Obama, and say the foreign policy that their foreign policy understanding is uniquely reckless.
Well, I mean, Boot's not a constitutional scholar; he's a military historian. So, I think he's making more of an argument about active norms rather than constitutional norms. And I have no idea what Boot's view on the declaration of war are, although I assume it's fairly I assume it's fairly hawkish in practice because he's one of the most hawkish commentators in the world. But the constitutional argument that I think you probably take issue is more with what John Yoo tends to argue, and Yoo is kind of this boogeyman because of the memos about interrogation, but his arguments are, from a libertarian point of view, his arguments really deserve grappling with, because what he's saying is that at the time he's making an originalist argument. He's saying at the time of the founding, a declaration of war didn't mean that's when war starts. It means that's when the diplomatic relations between countries changes, and there's some historical support for that. But I think you're also right that the declare clause is clearly about the king shouldn't be able to start a war by himself, and the fact that diplomatic conventions have changed shouldn't mean that principle is moot. And I think it's an unresolved part of American law that could use revisiting, because I don't think the War Powers Act is working, because I
agree. I agree with that. I also think, I guess another frustration that I have is that there are a lot of people and institutions on the right that extol the founders and their vision of American life, and talk about wanting to return to it. And I wouldn't want to say that everything is correct just because the founders did it. At the same time, I object. Sure, among lots of other examples, and so I don't think the founders did it this way is a trump card by any means. But I get frustrated by institutions like the Claremont Institute is probably a really good example, because their explicit reason for existence is to return the principles of the founding to preeminence in American life, right? And I don't see how the foreign policy that they advocate in the Claremont Review of Books, for example, or their notions of the role of the American military generally are at all compatible with what we had at the time of the founders. I mean, to pick a really simple example, right? There was this notion that standing armies were a dangerous thing at that time, and that the common defense would be provided for by getting together the citizen militias and keeping them prepared when the need arose. I'm not saying that we should go back to that. I don't think that that's tenable in the world today, right? At the same time, I think that there's this lack of acknowledgement that I guess it seems to me like an illegitimate attempt when I see like the foreign policy that the Claremont Institute puts forth, and they will quote from George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or all the rest, Abraham Lincoln especially, when it's convenient to do so, they will invoke them. And they kind of wrap their whole enterprise as if it should have extra heft because it's what the founders would have wanted. But actually, I don't think that that's the case. I actually think that
Claremont is a very interesting institution, because the Claremont guys were criticizing Bush from the right. Basically, they were saying we're not fighting the war on terror hard enough. Norman Podhoretz had a massive article, sort of detailing the various critics of the Bush doctrine, and he put them into the category of the super hawks. And they do not agree with me on democracy promotion. And I think Claremont is really in the Jacksonian tradition. And what I mean by that is I'm a big fan of Walter Russell Mead's sort of his taxonomy of American foreign policy traditions, and so the Jeffersonian tradition that views war mainly through the prism of how it threatens liberty, which is I think I'd fairly characterize you as a Jeffersonian, and the Wilsonian tradition that sees spreading American values as the key, and also multilateralism is part of the Wilsonian tradition too. And the Jacksonian traditions don't deal with foreigners unless they bother you, but if they do, kill them, have no mercy and give no quarter. And Claremont what the Claremont guys have been doing for years is making a very sophisticated argument for that. But you're right. It's not that intellectual lineage it traces back to Andrew Jackson. It doesn't trace back to George Washington so much, except to the extent that Andrew Jackson was a product of what came before him.
Why don't we transition to domestic policy?
Sure.
For a minute, and one of the recent, I guess it isn't so much part of the presidential race, but there's been a big controversy over Chick-fil-A and its CEO basically being a vocal opponent of gay marriage, and a few Democratic mayors, Rahm Emanuel being one of them, and a mayor in Boston, I forget his name,
Menino,
is another.
This is
basically saying don't operate in our city.
This is a very weird thing because first of all, it's never been a secret that Chick-fil-A was owned by conservative Christians. They were they're like one of the very few fast food restaurants that's closed on Sunday, and everyone knows that's because they think their employees should be going to church with their families on Sunday. But and it's not a secret that they've been giving money to anti-gay marriage causes. And I should say for background that I am a supporter of gay marriage. I was actually just at a fundraiser last weekend that my friend Walter Olson threw that was specifically conservative and libertarian gay marriage supporters raising money to protect the marriage equality law in Maryland. And so, I don't, but the idea is just so strange to me that because I understand people who are like, I'm not going to eat at Chick-fil-A because I disagree with their politics, although, given my sort of neocon foreign policy views and libertarian foreign policy views, or libertarian domestic policy views, if I didn't eat at places where the owners disagreed with my politics, I'd go hungry. But I understand if you want to boycott Chick-fil-A, fine. But the idea that someone would say we're going to use zoning law to keep you out of our city because I disagree with your political advocacy is really chilling and kind of horrifying. And
yeah, I agree. And I think that can you imagine if it was a gay marriage supporter, if it were a CEO that was in support of gay marriage, and a mayor or a governor in Texas, say, were saying we're not going to let you.
Right, it would be a national outrage, and rightly so.
It seems to me the reaction would be wildly different.
There
would be
actually
widespread out.
And that was actually a point that was made in the Boston Globe editorial, and the mayor actually backed off. He said, "Okay, I can't really do anything to stop them." But the Boston Globe editorial, that was one of their lines. Like, if a conservative mayor tried to keep a pro-gay marriage business out of his city, it would obviously be an outrage. And there was a Globe editorial. There was Adam Serwer wrote something in Mother Jones, Glenn Greenwald at Salon, Scott Lemieux at the American Prospect. I think a lot of liberals sort of instinctively get this, that you can't, just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean you unleash the government on them. And
yeah, I think liberal journalists have been really good on this as opposed to Democratic politicians.
And I think that's interesting because the sort of principle that the sort of First Amendment principles are part of our classical liberal heritage and really aren't in dispute among anyone with the least bit of ideological sophistication. But there seems to be this authoritarian strand among particularly big city Democrats. There was Rahm Emanuel said something about this in Chicago. There was someone in the New York City government, although Bloomberg was surprisingly good on this. But
what Emanuel did rankled me, I think, most of all. Maybe just because I know a little bit more about his background.
Because he worked for a president that opposed gay marriage until 6 months ago.
Right. I mean, he didn't only work for Barack Obama, who opposed gay marriage until earlier this year. He also worked for Bill Clinton as a policy advisor when Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. And it's, I understand that that times have changed and that Democrats have changed their position on these issues, and I'm not suggesting that anyone who feels one way about it and worked for someone who felt differently is guilty of hypocrisy. At the same time, it's kind of strange, right, to say that if you're against gay marriage now, you're not qualified to run a fast food joint in a city, whereas a few years ago you were the best guy to be president. Because that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
the best guy
I guess the
most
the most sanguine interpretation you could make of it is that this is just pure signaling that these big city politicians want to signal to their constituents that they, support their values. But on the other hand, but at the same time, it's just incredibly creepy. The mayor of San Francisco's tweet was that the nearest Chick-fil-A to San Francisco is 40 miles away, and I suggest they stay away. I mean, you run a police force. That's not just someone saying, no one will like you here. That's a threat at gunpoint.
I think it's definitely it's surprising to me that anyone who reaches a position that takes as much time and effort to get to as a big city mayor doesn't understand, I guess doesn't have a better idea of the responsibilities of their office and the way that things that they say, the official heft that it carries, and the need to be very careful about telling people that you're going to discriminate against them because of their political viewpoints. So I guess we're in agreement on this one. Maybe we should move on to one thing I wanted to run by you. So I've been thinking a lot about third-party candidates because I'm not going to vote for Obama or Romney, and I've been a fan of Gary Johnson since he was running as a Republican, and of course he faces long and almost certainly insurmountable odds of even being a contender in the present presidential race. And I think a lot of people that I talk to are dissatisfied with the Republican and Democratic candidates. At the same time, they're uninclined to do what they would say is throwing away their vote by voting for a third-party candidate. I'm sympathetic to all the different ways of thinking of this issue. It's kind of an intractable problem, but what I want to run by you is basically just a couple ideas that I have about what you should do if you're someone who is averse to quote-unquote throwing away your vote, but also is actually dissatisfied with the two-party candidates, and maybe you'd prefer a Libertarian, maybe you'd prefer a Green Party candidate, maybe some third party that I've never even heard of. But there are a couple of things that I think make pragmatic sense, and one of them is early in the process. If you're going to hold your nose and vote for someone, make that be something that you do at the last minute on Election Day. Until that point, if you are getting calls from pollsters asking you who do you want to win, say the person you really want to win. And if everyone did that, it would be a lot easier for someone like Gary Johnson to get a foot in the door enough to appear in the presidential debates, because it's all based on, or at least a lot of it is based on, how people are polling, whether they can cross whatever threshold that in the primaries, CNN and Fox and whatever, and in the general election, the Presidential Debate Commission, crossing that threshold, whether it's 8%, 10%, 15%. The other thing that I would say is on Election Day, if you live in a swing state and you don't want to throw away your vote, and you think that Romney is a little bit better or Obama is a little bit better, then go ahead and vote for them. If you live in California like me, if you live in Utah, if you live in a safe state for one candidate or the other, vote for the person who you really want to win without any consideration for who will win. Because again, that signal that you're sending that this third party is deserving of support is makes a lot bigger difference than your meaningless vote in a contest that is already decided. And I guess I'll let you jump in 1 minute. I guess the last thing that I would say is the goal isn't necessarily for a third-party candidate to win. A lot of people see that is probably implausible for the foreseeable future. Even crossing a certain threshold, even 15% support, even 10% support probably, is enough for the other parties to start thinking, what can we take from this third party and implement into our own platform? And so that's my case for modified third-party voting, I guess.
Actually, I've voted for the Libertarian candidate a few times, and I actually haven't decided yet what I'm going to do this time around. Although, from what I understand from LP activists, is that it's an open question whether Johnson's going to make the ballot, so that decision may be made for me. I don't believe Barr did, although I voted for Bob Barr in last round because I was in Maryland, and on the logic you just said, that I was not living in a swing state. There was the result was predetermined, and but I didn't vote Libertarian the cycle before because I just I felt like the LP had become a little too much of a sort of an unserious hotbed of kind of a type of radicalism that didn't really appeal to me, and and part of the reason I voted for Barr is because no one would confuse Barr for a radical. In fact, some hardcore LP types were very angry that he won the nomination. So I was hoping that if he did a little better, maybe they would imbue the LP with a little bit of pragmatic instinct, and he actually did terribly. So, but be that as it may, I'm sort of undecided this time because I like Johnson a lot, and I do think that ending the drug war is a very important issue that not enough people are talking about. It would be nice for it to have some more visibility. But I'm sort of on the fence. If he gets on the ballot, I might vote for him, but it sort of depends on if Romney pisses me off or not, which is sort of even odds. But I'd say that if you have sort of dissident views, like we have, it's sort of the nature of a first past the post winner take all system that it's going to cash out to a two-party system, and both the Democratic and Republican parties, they're much more coherently ideologically sorted these days than they have been in the past. Certainly when segregationists and northern liberals were in coalition, that was far more unwieldy than it is now. But it's still the Democrats include sort of lower class, socially conservative, economically populist voters and upper class technocratic liberals, and the Republican Party includes suburban business owners who are worried about taxes and lower class evangelicals who are worried about the social drift of the country, and I'd say if you have a view that doesn't seem to prevail in either party, there's a lot you can do to advocate for it. And I think sort of the Ron Paul faction, for all their weirdness, they've gotten. There was an audit the Fed vote in Congress this week, and it won. And if you have an issue that's not in the mainstream of your party, join, give a think tank, write an article, or give to a magazine, subscribe to things. give to a political action committee that's single issue. I mean, there are all kinds of organizations that are advocating for issues, not for parties. And
it's interesting. Ron Paul is an interesting case of someone who has looked at the options of going third party or trying to work within the Republican Party, and has kind of chosen both or neither, or however you want to put it. And I'm curious to see what Rand Paul's trajectory is going to be. To what extent, I think it probably depends a lot on who's elected. I think it's probably easier for him in many ways if Obama is reelected than if Romney is elected. But I'll be curious to see either way, sort of how he navigates that question, and especially the extent to which he is a dissident on foreign policy or goes along with the Republicans on foreign policy. I think it could go either way.
But I think Rand Paul he's a much cannier guy than his father. I mean, his father will take these principled stands. He doesn't mind voting no on everything and getting nothing accomplished for decades at a time. Whereas Rand has an eye for things where his views have some wider appeal. And just to give you an example, earlier this year, around there were raids on the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic, whatever it's called, the things that are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy to promote like political party building abroad, were raided in Egypt, and people like me were writing, we need to use Egypt's foreign aid as leverage and cut it off at least temporarily, and Rand Paul noticed this, and Rand Paul, of course, is against all foreign aid on principle, and so he noticed this, and he introduced a bill, and like his statement about it was, some of us have different views about the role of foreign aid in U.S. foreign policy, but I think we can all agree that in this case we shouldn't be giving it to them while they're doing this. So, it was a way of, it caused some trouble on the floor. I don't remember what the end game on it was, but it showed some good instincts about, if you have a view that's on the margin, look for people who disagree with you, who might agree with you in one case, and try and get something done on that.
Yeah, and I actually think that maybe I'm just inclined to think that way because I do have so many marginal views, but I think American politics would probably be better off if more people, instead of forming coalitions where you have friends and enemies, if they were a little bit more strategic in being willing to work with people when they agree on a very narrow issue, being willing to work to advance that issue, even if they disagree about everything else.
And don't get me wrong, I do think that having the two-party system has a lot to recommend it, and I'm not a fan of party systems that encourage fracturing along small ideological divisions. I watch Israeli politics pretty closely, and I think proportional representation has been disastrous for the ability of that country to make sound policy. But and I can expound on that if you want. I know we're almost at an hour, but
yeah. Well, let's actually let's bracket that because I don't know anything about it first of all, so maybe it's something I should read up about before we talk about it. But yeah, we'll do it again sometime. And thanks for joining me. And we should.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Connor. All right.